Hi, 1990s were a time of progress so rapid that if you wanted to keep up, you'd need to upgrade your rig every year or so. Why, you may wonder? To be able to run these games looking great and running smooth. So, let's check out some of the most notable culprits. It may just be my rough estimate, but I believe that Nova Logic's Comanche Maximum Overkill was the first title to popularize asset streaming to offer seamless 3D worlds, a trend that would take over the world within the next few months. Maximum Overkill broke away from the still crawling in 1992 polygon-based tech by using its own voxel space engine to render terrain. Instead of tiling flat, textured triangles, it read a single height map and projected vertical voxels, so columns to be precise, straight onto the screen. The effect may look a bit jaggy today, but back then it was borderline revolutionary. Terrain detail naturally fell off with distance, making discrete mesh LOD levels unnecessary as the engine itself had it built in, while simple intensity ramps and pre-computed light tables gave hills and craters a convincing sense of depth under a fixed sun direction. I know, it sounds like a technical mambo-jumbo, but what I mean by all that is that the visual result was an organic feeling world you could fly over smoothly at VGA resolutions and 256 colors on an average 486. Under the hood, Comanche leaned heavily on hand-optimized x86 assembly and fixed-point math to squeeze every last cycle out of a 1992 PC. Although Nova Logic's published minimum spec was a 386SX, most players needed at least a 4MB machine with a 486 to hit playable frame rates of roughly 20 to 30 FPS at 320x200. All of the CPU time went straight into terrain rasterization and simple per-pixel shading, so the helicopter's polygonal cockpit, guns and smoke effects had to share what little horsepower remained. So, if you consider your PC to be worth at least, I don't know, let's say 486 horses, only 6 of them went into that. Or 5, and one was idling, eating grass or whatever the else horses eat. Anyway, to keep the environment streaming in as you flew over them, the engine loaded terrain tiles in the background from those file into XMS-backed buffers. By prefetching the next blocks during the quieter moments in the cockpit, it hid most disk 6 without ever dropping below a few hundred meters of look ahead. While you may be wondering what XMS is, as it sounds like a model of a new electrical-powered car, it was in fact a kind of memory, or more accurately, a logical partition of your memory, as though split it in numerous different chunks of equally as odd names. But getting deep into this memory rabbit hole is something for a different day. Let's just say that some of these old games required a lot of pre-configuration of those before you could run them comfortably. Maximum Overkill pushed hardware to the limit by throwing essentially every CPU cycle it could get its paws on at the real-time voxel rendering. It was perhaps not a benchmark per se, but could easily be used to quote-unquote barometer PC power and performance around 1992. Have you ever wondered how a 92 PC, a plain 386SX at 25 MHz with just 2 MB of RAM, could run a fully 3D texture map dungeon? That was the magic of Ultima Underworld, the Stygian Abyss, the first ever real-time 3D RPG. Blue Sky Productions built a true polygon engine from ground up, writing almost everything in hand-tuned x86 assembly and fixed-point math. What does it mean? I don't know. I mean, I do, but could never explain it well enough. But every wall, floor and ceiling was textured, drawn at 320x200 in 256 colors, and no tile hacks, no cheat engines were used, only good old heaps of imagination and even more programming mastery. So something that I always wanted to have, but never did. Kinda like the lottery win. Anyway, to keep your oh so magnificent 2 MB of 1994 RAM from choking, the game streamed map data and bitmaps straight off the disk. And yes, it may appear that the subject of today's video is streaming, as you will hear the term a lot, but trust me, it's so much more than just that. The Stygian Abyss kept 2 tiny 32KB buffers in memory, one constantly feeding data to the renderer, while the other quietly loaded the next zone, so your only stall if it ever happened, cause it really shouldn't, was when your hard drive failed to spit out data fast enough to those buffers. Now, you may be like, 32KB? I mean, even in 1992 it was nothing, how did they manage to achieve so much with so little? Well, it turns out that the folks from Blue Sky were rather crafty, and out went brute force drawing, in came a sector-based portal system that called any walls you couldn't see. Think of it as if you don't see it, it doesn't exist, and henceforth don't need to be calculated. It freed a lot of cycles from the CPU, allowing it to invest it into something else. You know, creature AI, NPC pathfinding, special effects like torchlight flicker and whatnot, all of that ran alongside the renderer. and on a clean 386DX setup, Stygian Abyss could hit roughly 20-25 FPS even in the thick of battle with blood-hungry bots. Or rats. Even with rats. Can you imagine? Ultima Underworld's underlying tech lit a fire under its software, because not only it proved that there were better technological solutions than that of Wolfenstein 3D, but also that they could be made to run on most current at the time PCs, provided they had a semi-decent cached HDD and a MAV coprocessor. The assembly-honed renderer inspired future engines, proving that consumer-grade PCs were capable of immersive 3D RPGs long before Windows 95. System Shock's engine was nothing short of wizardry. A fully texture-mapped 3D world with real-time light sources, flickering fluorescent and murky water effects, all squeezed into a single DOS executable, barely topping a few megabytes. Rather than loading an entire level at once, System Shock opted into streaming the entire room geometry, wall and floor textures, sound effects and AS scripts straight from the disk, pulling in only what you needed to keep the memory usage lean. You know, how you pull the crispy fried bacon stripes from the plate cause they're lean, leaving fatty ones for someone else. Or is that just me? Anyway, hand-tuned assembly routines handled palette fades and sprite translucency, giving water that uncanny glow and making lights feel eerily alive. Well, 1994 alive. Underneath the surface, a flexible event-driven scripting system managed dozens of autonomous bots, mutants and security programs, and each of them has its own dynamic state, patrolling, hunting or repairing, running on a well-crafted scheduler that runs side by side with the main render loop. A custom disk input-output layer read big, continuous chunks to tame those clunky hard drive seek times, while audio routines juggled MIDI music, digital effects, and even audio tracks through Sound Blaster's DMA channels for a layered cinematic soundtrack. Peek into any computer terminal and you dive into cyberspace, a wireframe VR realm that ate the extra earlier saved up CPU cycles, but more than doubled the game's atmosphere by letting you hack doors, splice security, or watch Shodan's programs explode in 3D. Back in the station, you could bash pushable crates, smash glass panels, and even crawl through vents, all feeding into the same unified physics and collision code. Firing this beast of a game in 1994 on a Pentium 90 meant treating your CPU to an instant overload shock, hammering your hard drive with constant calls for data and starving your RAM, using up any and all empty bytes of it your system could find. So investing in a top-of-the-line hardware meant smoother frame rates and shorter load times. System Shock proved that DOS machines could sustain living and breathing immersive games if you were brave enough to let your setup reach truly subsurface hot levels. Bullfrog's engineers built Magic Carpet on a true, voxel-based height-field engine that computed per-pixel elevation interpolation, texture mapping and dynamic light in each frame. Cast a spell, and hundreds of height map points instantly recalculate, sending dirt spikes rocketing up or molten lakes spilling downhill, all the while you fly around on your enchanted rack, grinning at all the destruction that you're spreading over this magical land. With only 4 MB of minimum RAM required, the team implemented hierarchical chunk loadings, trimming terrain tiles from disk via direct input-output to avoid DOS buffer stalls, and unloading distant sections on the fly, so only what you saw lived in your system's limited memory, and what was saved up from the processing power went straight into the special effects. So particle effects, fiery projectiles, billowing dust clouds, scattering debris, and whatnot. And while these were nothing more than mere sprites, they were packed in tight formation for a heightened visual effect. Bullfrog hand-tuned assembly loops to sort, cool, and batch these thousands of little images, slashing over draw and freeing even more extra cycles from CPU so that they could be used somewhere else. For instance, for audio callbacks that synchronize dynamic adaptive music with on-screen events using Sound Blaster Pro's DMA channels for seamless looping and effect layering. Whenever you were casting Earth Spell or Lava, the engine recalculated affected voxels in real time, pushing both CPU registers and memory buses to their absolute limit. Magic Carpet's demanding presentation meant that to achieve a smooth at the time 20-30 FPS, an SVGA card with at least 1 MB of video memory was needed and as much RAM as you could throw at it. Magic Carpet's non-stop world deformation, real-time lighting and live soundtrack felt like sorcery back then, and they foreshadowed every open-world engine trick that followed in the years after. Buckle up, because you're about to develop a serious case of motion sickness and melancholy towards amazingly addictive simple 3D shooters that we just don't get these days anymore. Descent thrusts you inside a twisting, zero-G mind where up could be anywhere, and very often is exactly there, anywhere that's relative to your position top. Parallax's brilliant engine was the first FPS to render fully textured, true 3D tunnels in real time while letting you pitch, roll and yaw through all 6 degrees of freedom. It felt freeing, but also at times disorienting if you jumped into descent coming from games like Doom. Your craft wasn't on rails or bound to any surface, every narrow corridor, overlapping shaft and hidden alcove was built from genuine 3D polygons and not flat sprites pretending to be walls. And all of these locations could be explored. Technically speaking, Descent's code, which was mostly hand-tuned assembly trickery, cranked through hundreds of transformed elite polygons each frame at a whole slew of resolutions, from 320x200 to 640x480. Light sources, from flares to muzzle flash sprites, weren't baked in, and the engine darkened and brightened palette entries on the fly for dynamic shading, making Descent's narrow, enemy ship-filled corridors feel very immersive, and every dogfight a treat to the effects-hungry eyes. Speaking of effects, particle like sparks and smoke were rendered as tiny billboards in tight loops, which may have not been a very sophisticated solution perhaps, but looked decently and didn't add too much stress to the CPU that was already working overtime. Multiplayer pushed the same smart tech overflowing engine over IPX, serial cables or modems, and hosting up to 8 fighters in frantic deathmatches was a true treat to both ice and playability. A light well-synced protocol kept ships and physics in lockstep with minimal lag, which is not something that could be said about all shooters from the period. So playing Descent with other lost none of its single-player charm. While Descent could theoretically run on a stock 386 with as little as 4 MB of RAM, it would also crawl, like a turtle, dragging its tiny feet over freshly laid out double-sided sticky tape. And it would only ever reach something abstract like 15 FPS from time to time, dipping below in heavy combats constantly. On a 486 class or early Pentium PCs with chunky memory buses, and later even 3D accelerator cards, Descent would fly, forgive me the bad pun, and easily reach or even pass the silky smooth by 1990s standard 30 FPS at high res. And in doing so, it proved that real-time 6-axis flight plus live lightning demanded both peak CPU power and memory bandwidth. By today's standards, Mechwarrior 2 31st Century Combat is just fugly. I mean, look at it. When I see a game like that today, I instantly go into troubleshooting mode, wondering if it's time to replace my GPU. But that's today, and back then it was another thing entirely. And just because Mechwarrior uses no textures whatsoever and instead just gore shades its polygons, serving them in environments that feel empty, desolate and simply put, boring, it doesn't mean that it's a bad game. And it's not, and especially that when it released in 1995, it was all kinds innovative. And while it may not be the most immediately noticeable, the underlying technological solutions were rather groundbreaking. What Mechwarrior lacked in texturing, it more than made up with number of polygons all of these giant machines were built with. And it was not unusual for each of the mechs to sport as many of them as some of the early FPSs couldn't handle with their entire screens at once. To deal with all that hardware stress, Activision's developers did some coding magic, replacing slow floating point math with integer lookup tables in assembly. The result? Buttersmooth 30 FPS on a strong 486 DX4 or an average Pentium. All because Pentium could utilize branch prediction to reduce overhead, so careful use of pre-computed vertex transform tables allowed for the presentation to shine on these beasts of CPUs. Did I really just said Buttersmooth about 30 FPS? Ignore me. Later addition of the Glide edition of the game offloaded a chunk of processing power from the CPU straight onto 3dFX Voodoo that not only ran the game at much higher frame rates, but also added welcome bells and whistles in the form of bilinear filtering and deeper 16-bit color palette. Radar sweeps, hit gauges and weapon status readouts run in ultra-tight C++ loops, communicating with the engine by shared memory buffers to offload rendering tasks and maintain consistent HUD refresh rates, all the while staying under DOS's single-tasking limits, effectively acting as if it was run in a separate DOS process. Mechwarrior 2 demonstrated the benefits of offloading tasks to parallel processes and GPUs, and effectively became a blueprint for high-end DOS simulations, driving adoption of 3D accelerator cards in the gaming community. Looking Glass Studios' Terra Nova wasn't content with cramped corridors, small rooms and bodies covering every corner of said locations in various stages of decomposing. It hurled you into vast, seamless outdoor battlefields in 640x480 resolution in 256 colors. And it done it all with a pure software renderer. No glide, no direct 3D or windows, it banked switch a full megabyte of video RAM each frame to draw detailed terrain and hulking mechs on a standard Pentium with just 8 to 16 megabytes of RAM. I mean, you could technically run Terra Nova on a 486, but it was more of a test of patience than a game in that configuration. The real magic of Terra Nova was its on-the-fly streaming. Textures, terrain geometry, and even CD quality voiceovers all slid off the disk via custom input-output routines directly into RAM, keeping level sizes gargantuan, yet avoiding dreaded load screen stalls. And while it's something you expect out of every open-world game today, in the mid-90s there were but a few that could offer such a luxury without breaks in gameplay. Every explosion kicked up volumetric smoke particles, and every energy blast cast per polygon dynamic lighting, all in hand-optimized assembly loops that coaxed every cycle from your CPU and every byte from your VGA memory, putting the components to the test and making them sweat like they've not sweat before, like a sumo wrestler running a 20k marathon. Sounds pretty innovative for the time, doesn't it? Well, combine it all with built-in simple mech physics model and round it up with arcade gameplay loop, and you get an experience in which your PC truly feel like it was driving an ancient war machine, steaming, smoking and barely handling it all like a steampunk tank. No, like a broken steampunk tank. Sprawling, software-shadowed landscapes and clunky mechs made Terra Nova the last hurrah for pure DOS 3D before the accelerators took over in the coming months and Windows reigned. While Duke Nukem 3D was not 3D at all, it was most definitely peak 2.5D, as it ditched Doom's static BSP in favor of fast quote-unquote portal system. What that means is that rooms and sectors could be finely placed one over another, for as long as you, the player, never saw both at once, letting designers truly let their imaginations go and create high, multiple-level stall structures, all the while never breaking the immersion of that perceived true 3D. It also saved on resources on rendering, as Duke's engine never wasted any cycles on what you couldn't see. Floors and ceilings could hinge on walls, so ramps and tiled balconies felt natural, and you could even look up and down, crouch, swim underwater and peer into simulated real-time mirrors. This may have not been groundbreaking by 1996, but since Ultima Underworld, no other game really done that so well. Palette-powered lighting and sector-specific color maps faked color lights on the fly without using any extra textures, while floor slopes and bumps added architectural flair. If you had a modern Sunblaster card or equally as powerful equivalent, then DMA-driven digital mixer topped it even up to 32 simultaneous samples, so Duke's commentary, gun blasts and explosions all could layer over MIDI music without the need for hardware sound mixer and not dropping any samples. All of that fidelity naturally came with a price. And it was one you had to pay in hardware and tears. Beefy CPU, strong, sporting at least 1MB of VRAM graphic card was a must for comfortable play, and if you wanted to game in higher resolutions and stay over 60 FPS, then Pentium CPU and Voodoo card were basically a must. And this is where these tears come in, as top-of-the-line hardware was not cheap at all. Upon its release, Duke Nukem 3D became the yardstick. If your PC couldn't handle its complex levels with destructible elements at smooth frame rates and high resolution, you needed faster CPU, more RAM, or preferably an accelerator card. It cemented expectations that games would leverage dedicated graphics hardware when available. John Carmack's Quake engine shattered Doom's 2.5D ceiling by rendering 100% polygonal worlds with pre-baked light maps on every surface for crisp, static global illumination. Models got gored shaded skin, while the world glowed from per-face light maps that it calculated offline and packed into their BSP files. To hit playable frame rates of roughly 60 FPS at 320x200 and 30 FPS at 640x480 on a high-tier Pentium 120, Carmack hand-wrote tight assembly loops for the software rasterizer, leaned on massive sine cosine lookup tables, unrolled scanline inner loops and pre-scheduled key math calls to keep the pipeline full. And yeah, I realize how it sounds to you, cause to me it sounds exactly the same. There's a lot of technical jargon that I could never even dream of wrapping my head around, but what you really have to take out of it all is that he used his Omega-level coding skills to hold the sun and move the earth of video game engine design, to provide for the underlying tech that allowed Quake to look the way it did and run relatively decent on modern at the time systems. Going below Pentium and a decent at least 1MB card though meant that Quake would drag and would be more pain than pleasure. Quake ran its game logic and AI through Quake-C, an interpreted bytecode VM that let designers tweak monsters and weapons on the fly without rebuilding the engine for each testing iteration. And while the tech like that is nothing new today, in 1996 it was one-of-a-kind solution that made it easily moddable. When the Quake World update rolled out in the late 96, it rewrote multiplayer. Reliable, heavily compressed packets plus client-side prediction let deathmatches chug along over dial-up and LAN with minimal lag. Then a little while later, GL Quake brought OpenGL to the party, and id Software followed up with a mini GL glide layer, so 3dfx Voodoo owners were gifted with blazing fast fill rates, bilinear filtering and higher resolutions for the first time. Quake effectively defined the spec sheet for PC gamers of the mid-90s, a fast Pentium, 8 to 16 MB of RAM, and if you crave something smoother, higher resolution glory at silky frame rates, a 3D accelerator. Beyond raw speed, its mod-friendly Quakesy world inspired sprawling community maps and total conversions, each demanding more CPU clock and memory headroom, fueling the first real enthusiast hardware arms race. Each of these DOS classics wasn't just pretty for its time. There were technical proofs of concept, forcing consumers to upgrade CPUs, RAM, storage and graphics to experience them properly and in full. They stand as monuments to the era when every new title was a hardware-stressing spectacle. If you liked the video and would like to see more of these deep dives into the heart of DOS, hit those like, sub and bell icons. For now though, I'm gonna skedaddle to work on another video and I'll talk to you soon.